Hello there. It sounds oh so reasonable to just sit on the fence between Hamas and Israel while calling for a ceasefire, doesn't it? But danger lurks for us all were Israel to be seen to be forced into such compliance. So Sadiq Khan has demanded a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, so splintering his Labour Party in the process. And now we have 250 eminent King's Counsel and other lawyers calling for the government to press for a ceasefire. And then there's Jeremy Corbyn, of course. And as far as I'm concerned, they are the types contributing to this huge spike in anti-Semitic attacks in the UK, as reported by the Met. But as I said, there is danger for us all should Israel cave into a ceasefire before they achieve their military aims. And it seems the US and UK governments understand this. In fact, there are two risks to this. But first, let's remember what happened to the last ceasefire. Hamas broke that ceasefire on the 7th of October this year. They broke it viciously and without mercy, targeting children. And everyone wants there to be a new ceasefire? Just so Hamas can rearm and reorganise? And that's a real risk, and probably the wish of most calling for that ceasefire. Now Hamas is now saying that there can be no hostage releases until there is a ceasefire in place. Do I trust Hamas? No. Remember, they've already set a handful of hostages free during the current conflict, so if they were minded to, they could release them all. Except that some hostages are held by splinter groups, over which Hamas may not have any control. So once a ceasefire was in place, what other demands would Hamas make in return for the release of the hostages? All the while regrouping for more rocket attacks on Israel. And as usual, the deaths and damage caused by those Hamas rockets that fall short within the Gaza Strip can be blamed on Israel. So the first risk to Israel of a ceasefire is that Hamas is given time to regain strength and strike when the mood takes them. The second risk is far bigger, in that if Israel is seen to be forced by international will into a ceasefire, it degrades Israel's right to self-defence. It would set the precedent that self-defence is not allowed if even one civilian got caught up in the conflict as collateral damage. Or that's where it would trend towards, a position which only developed Western countries and their allies would be expected to abide by. And this is the real danger, because it would encourage, even reward, indiscriminate terrorist attacks. Now, a lot of people claim that Israel is losing the propaganda war because Hamas can hold up more civilian dead bodies on their side than Israel can. All as if it's some sort of numbers game. But in truth, Hamas is using its own innocent civilians as shields. And worse, surrounding countries refuse to take even one refugee out of Gaza. Something that I think is designed to put even more pressure on Israel to cave into a ceasefire. Now, on that narrative, this is how Hamas deals with a situation where they could be seen to lose the room themselves. This is an interview between the BBC's Middle East correspondent, Hugo Bakiga, and the Deputy Foreign Minister for Hamas in Gaza, Ghazi Hamad.
There was no command to kill any civilians.
You say this was a military operation, but the result of it was that hundreds of civilians were killed.
Because the area is very wide, and there are many people there, and there was clashes and confrontation.
It's not confrontation. You invaded houses.
I don't have details what happened inside, but I can tell you that we didn't have any intention or decision to kill the civilians.
How do you justify killing people as they sleep, families, How do you justify killing hundreds
I
of
want
people
to stop this interview.
I
want to stop this interview.
Didn't like being held to account there, did he? And if Hamas is saying no orders to commit those atrocities were given, and that captured Hamas terrorists involved in the 7th of October atrocities are lying when they claim they were offered money and apartments for killing and taking hostages, then please disown them and round up those involved and put them on trial in the Gaza Strip. Prove your legitimacy to the world. But they won't. Now, a lot has been said about this concept of a state having the right to defend itself and its citizens. Israel was attacked and does have that right, but not, it seems, when the enemy cynically hides behind hospitals and schools. It seems that in the case of Israel, Hamas can do as it pleases with no repercussions except on the innocent on both sides. Now, you may have seen it before, but there was a very interesting conversation between the BBC's Katja Adler and an expert in this area of the law, Natasha Hdor. Something that's well worth a rewatch. Now, it says in Natasha Hdor's bio on the Six Pump Court website that after a law degree at Oxford University and an LLM specialising in public international law, Natasha clerked for the President of the Supreme Court of Israel in Jerusalem, acquiring a particular insight into the court's application of international law. So here's how that interview went.
Well, we can now speak to Natasha Hdor. She's a barrister and international law expert who also liaises with UK lawyers in Israel. And she joins me now from London. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, Katya.
First of all, in this situation, good morning, this very tense situation, people are looking for glimmers of hope. One of those being the arrival of the first trucks of aid, another, the release of 2 of the hostages currently held inside Gaza. A reminder, we're 2 weeks on today from a massacre inside Israel, 1,400 people killed. The number of hostages taken into Gaza has been updated by Israel today to 210. That's in addition to the 2 who were released overnight. I was just wondering if I could ask you, from a legal perspective, how do governments go about trying to negotiate the release of these hostages? What concessions could be offered, even though we've been told in this case none were? How would it work?
Well, of course, the negotiations and the international diplomacy associated is a separate consideration entirely from the legal position. And we've heard, certainly from your reporting this morning, about international efforts behind the developments. But of course, those developments need to be seen in the context of this abduction, as you've been reporting, of over 200 hostages and those crimes of Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations which have led to a humanitarian crisis. Also in Israel, where the families of these hostages know that the orders of these terrorists were specifically to target women and children for kidnap and torture. The international law aspects of this are, of course, extremely important, and myths about Israel's conduct, about international law, have been playing a significant role in this crisis and in the coverage of it. And perhaps I can be clear that from an international law perspective, Israel does not only have the right to a robust response, but under the Convention on the Prevention and the Punishment of Genocide, the crime of genocide, it also has an affirmative obligation, like the rest of the signatories to that convention, to make sure that never again means never again.
So, from an international law perspective, Israel has both the right to defend itself robustly, but under the Convention on the Prevention and the Punishment of Genocide, Israel has the obligation to ensure never again means never again. And so do all the signatories to that convention. That says to me that this means there should be a far harder line taken internationally against Hamas. And now that Hamas has opened that Pandora's box, it is in no position to cry foul and try and play the victim. Now we come to the bit about how Israel can defend itself. Hamas and its supporters, it seems, are saying that all civilian deaths must be prevented. But that's not what international law says.
Well, as you say, under international law, Israel has the right to defend itself. As we've been saying, these attacks orchestrated by Hamas inside Israel 2 weeks ago today were unprecedented. We're talking about a massacre as well as hostage taking of people, including women and children. Also under international law, though, as well as the right to defend yourself as a party, there are also rules of war and engagement. So it's not that you can't defend yourself, it's how you defend yourself in the situation. In this case, how Israel defends itself. And there's been a lot of concentration. We've been talking about aid today, the plight of Palestinian civilians on the ground, that siege that's been tightened on the Gaza Strip until today. No food, no water, no medical supplies, aerial bombardments day and night aimed, Israel says, at Hamas and Hamas infrastructure. But the number of casualties amongst civilians has been very, very high.
Well, let me pick up, if I may, on those points in turn. In compliance with its obligations under international law to minimize civilian casualties, Israel is issuing warnings of where it will be striking Hamas terrorist infrastructure. It's a practice used by all law-abiding countries. It is telling them to leave in order to try to save their lives. And of course, there has also been mass evacuation of Israeli civilians from the north and south of Israel, away from the borders with terrorist organizations. But there is another myth here, that Israel has an obligation to supply Hamas terrorists with electricity and other goods, and that is without basis in international law. Israel is not required to fund or assist Hamas war efforts as it attempts to butcher Jews. And of course, since Hamas violently seized control in 2007, Israel has continued to provide a part of Gaza's fuel, electricity, water, and also medical care to Palestinian civilians that Hamas neglects and abuses. That isn't viable during a military campaign where Hamas exploits these transfers, stealing supplies and penetrating humanitarian organizations to mask its terror operations and to launder funds. And Hamas uses the electricity grid in Gaza to continue to fire missiles onto Israeli civilians. That firing has continued in the course of the last hour and your broadcasts. And of course, some of these rockets from Gaza fall short, as we saw with the Al Ali Hospital car park. In the case of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a third of the rockets fired in the last exchange of theirs fell short, killing many Gazan civilians. But I must stress, in relation to your question, there is no requirement to provide resources. International law only requires that Israel facilitate the passage of food and medicine by third parties if such goods can be reliably delivered without diversion to Hamas. And we know that is not the case because Hamas controls Gaza. And in fact, the basic rules outlined by the Geneva and the Hague Conventions are that sieges are lawful unless they are deliberately aimed at starving the local population. The IDF has been repeatedly clear about its objectives: defeating Hamas, establishing a new reality in Gaza where Israel doesn't face a genocidal terror organization that has the will or capability to attack Israeli civilians, and rescuing the hostages. And if governments and international organizations...
And Natasha Hdor, if I could just interrupt you there. Sorry, just a moment, Natasha Hdor. Sorry to interrupt you, but you've made a number of points very clearly from your perspective.
A lot to take in there. And why did Katja Adler interrupt her? Was the narrative not to the Beeb's liking? Was a producer screaming down her earpiece to stop the flow of good, accurate information? So there you have it. It is not a war crime to refuse to supply your enemy with water, electricity and food. You only have to facilitate third-party aid getting through to those that need it when it can't be diverted to the enemy, Hamas. Strange that everyone says Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians, but it's been supplying the Gaza Strip with fuel, electricity, water and medical care since Hamas took over in 2007. That is not genocide. As Natasha Haor said, Israel is not required to fund or assist Hamas in its waging of war. And the Israelis may be under a duty to minimise civilian casualties, but not to prevent all and any civilian deaths. And it does this by pre-warning where it will be conducting its strikes, so as to give the civilians time to get clear. As long as the Hamas thugs let them, of course. Oh, and don't forget that the Israelis themselves have removed 20,000 of their own citizens from frontline areas where they may be at risk. But in Gaza, Hamas hides behind the masses, and all of the surrounding countries are very keen to keep the citizens of Gaza as close to the Israeli guns as possible. Now we get to the concept of collective punishment.
As you say, under international law, and I, unlike you, I am not an international lawyer. Israel, in this case, it is allowed by parties under international law, if they can argue their reasons why, to have a siege. But what is not allowed under international law is something that is alleged by aid agencies, for example, and they say that what the effect on Palestinian civilians stuck inside Gaza, they say, seems like collective punishment. Seems like collective punishment. They say collective punishment is not allowed under international law. Of course, all of these legal questions are hotly contested.
Well, it's flatly not borne out by the facts on the ground. And if these aid organizations are invested in the interests of Gazan civilians, then they should devote their resources to facilitating the safe and rapid evacuation of Gazan's civilian population to the south, which Hamas has been seeking to hamper with reports of it bombing fleeing civilians. But the allegation that you have raised, Katya, is a reprehensible moral equivalence, and it is being drawn, it is utterly morally repugnant. It also attaches, of course, to the suggestion of proportionality in international law, that is about comparing casualty figures, and that is also not correct. Every strike that Israel takes, every military action is weighed up, it is analysed to make sure that according to international law, the anticipated collateral damage, the harm to civilians, is proportionate to the military aims of a strike that is militarily necessary and legitimately targets terrorist infrastructure. So these suggestions of collective punishment are morally reprehensible, liable.
As Natasha Hdor, you say that these allegations aren't borne out by facts on the ground. It is objective bodies such as the International Criminal Court, for example, who are brought up in times of conflict to examine situations in every single individual case about whether the rules of law or engagement were respected in individual particular cases. But we thank you very much for your time this morning, for joining us. Natasha Hdor there, international lawyer, barrister who also advises UK lawyers inside Israel.
A great answer from the lawyer. But as usual, the BBC correspondent has the last word, leaving no room for a riposte to the BBC agenda. And you can see that Natasha Hdor looks a bit miffed about it. But she gave a great performance. And she appeared on Talk TV's Julia Hartley-Brewer show later, where she called for the resignation of the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, for basically saying Israel caused those horrific attacks on October the 7th, and that Israel was clearly committing war crimes. But Natasha Hdor pointed out that the actions and words of UN officials were giving support to the terrorist Hamas genocidal aims. And she also slammed the idea of a ceasefire prior to the release of hostages. And here's something she said during that interview that backs up what I said earlier. What Israel has done, just like any law-abiding state, is provide warnings of the strikes it is taking. Those strikes are assessed under the principles of international law, importantly the principle of proportionality, to make sure civilian lives are saved to the utmost, quite to the contrary of Hamas's behaviour. That sounds to me like Israel is fulfilling its duties as required by international law. Natasha Hdor went on to say, But I think I need to address here that what we've been seeing, I think, comes down to a failure to stand up to the demands of the international community. World pressure has ultimately caused Israel to make dangerous security concessions over the last 20 years that have led to this atrocity. And one example of this is in relation to work permits for Palestinians to enter Israel. Between January and August this year, there were 400,000 entries from Gaza into Israel, mostly Palestinians coming to work in Israel. And this played a significant role in Hamas's planning and gathering specific, detailed family-based information, intelligence about their targets across 30 sites in the south of Israel. These terrorists, Julia, came armed with exact maps, detailing communities, households, how many people, how many children per family, and what they were instructed to do to them. And she went on to explain how one Israeli who had been dedicated for years to helping those in Gaza by providing jobs to get renewable energy into the Strip, and he was slaughtered along with the rest on October the 7th. Israel undeniably has the right to defend itself, and as far as I can see, is observing what international law actually says, not what the pro-Hamas, anti-Semitic mob wants us to think it is.